Putin is still desperate for manpower. Voluntary recruitment in Russia, is down by 40% now.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're catching up with Professor of Defence Studies Michael Clarke. He is a former Director General of the British think tank RUSI. He's a leading defence and security analyst. We speak regularly every week, actually, on BFBS SitRep. And his latest book, Great British Commanders, is out on the 30th of October. Mike Clarke, good to see you. North Korea is reported to be providing thousands of troops to fight for Russia. What can you tell us about this, and how big a deal is it if it's true?
Well, it's a series of reports, Kate, but at the moment it's only reports. I was speaking to some people in government. They say that they're monitoring it very closely, but what they're monitoring are reports. And so the Kiev Post was saying that 3,000 North Koreans are being prepared in what was being called the Buryat Battalion, although 3,000 is more than a battalion. That's more like a brigade, if that's what it is. And there are reports that some North Korean defectors had turned up in Ukraine as if they were part of a unit, but that's unconfirmed. So we can say there are reports. There are some reports that up to 10,000 North Koreans have been serving in support roles in Russia to release more Russian forces to go to the Ukraine front. So that's possibly true as well. But so far it hasn't happened. It may, because it would make a certain amount of sense. I mean, Putin is still desperate for manpower. Voluntary recruitment in Russia, is down by 40% now. And so the Russians have their own manpower problem, which will become more acute next year. And they will need more manpower from somewhere. And North Korea certainly is quite keen to provide it, even though it internationalizes the conflict even further. So I don't know that we're going to see North Koreans on the front line soon, but the possibility that there is at least one unit preparing to engage, and it is said to be preparing to engage in Kursk, is plausible, but not confirmed.
And on the subject of Kursk Oblast in Russia, the US-based think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, and others have said that Russia has taken back almost half of the occupied land in that area. How are they managing to do that? And what challenges are Ukrainian forces facing?
I'm not sure they've lost half, but they started off with about 900 square kilometres at the full extent of the Kursk incursion, and they've been pushed back now to about 600 kilometres, so they've lost certainly about a third. And that's partly because the Russians have now deployed the VDV, the airborne units there. They were slow to get decent units there. And it looks as if the Russians have deployed up to 50,000 troops into Kursk. And most of them are being led by Chechen units. So they're depending on the Chechens. They brought their own VDV in. The Ukrainians, none of us could see that they had more than 20 or 25,000 in the pocket at any given time. Like we thought that they actually went into the pocket with probably between 10 and 15,000, and they may well have reinforced since then. So I think that the overall situation is that the Ukrainians are probably now outnumbered by about 2-1, and they're holding about 2/3 of the territory that they began with, that they established themselves within, and they've lost the sort of northwest third of it. And now the weather's turning. It's been pretty wet in Kursk in the last few days, and the wet has made a difference, and that helps the attackers in this case rather than the defenders because of their wheeled vehicles that the Ukrainians have got. Also, the Ukrainians haven't really dug in Kursk because they were attacking. They kept moving forward. If they want to stay, then they're going to need to dig in, and they haven't done too much of that apparently. But it's still plausible that the Ukrainians will think that they've made their point, and they will not want their troops to fight some sort of battle to the death there, or they won't want them to be surrounded and have to surrender. So at some point, they don't want to keep Kursk, they'll withdraw, and they're quite close to their own border, they will do that. I'm sure they'd like to leave it until after the winter before they have to do that, and then they'll see what the political outcomes are after the American election and the attitude of the outside world to the future of Ukraine's war.
And in the last few days, the reporting has been that the big fight has been on the front line in Ukraine, in the east, in Kursk. Can you tell us how you see the situation there, what you understand it to be?
Yeah, I mean, the Russians are pushing all the way around. And it's undoubtedly the case that the Ukrainians have never been under greater pressure than they are now. The Russians began this push everywhere all at once back in the spring of this year. And they've kept it going. So here we are now in the autumn. They've done 6 months of pushing on every front, very, very hard. with sheer numbers, and they're still taking well over 1,000 casualties every day, and they're still throwing more and more men into the meat grinder. And the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. They are being pushed back, and they're frankly, from all the anecdotal reports that are coming out, they're frankly depressed and getting disheartened because they're basically facing these relentless attacks, which are not clever. The attacks aren't sophisticated. They're just relentless, 24 hours a day. So the troops are low on ammunition, they're even lower on sleep. However, the Russians have not taken Pokrovsk, and it looked as if they were determined to take Pokrovsk, and the weather is going to turn in another couple of weeks. They're still to the east and partly to the south of Pokrovsk, but they've not surrounded it. They are moving up to the Oskil River further north. The Ukrainians have told civilians to evacuate from Kupiansk. And if they lose Kupiansk, that will be a big push in the north. That will be a big loss in the north. But the Russians coming up to the Oskil River, that will be a big moment because the Oskil River is not very easy to cross. And it's not many crossing points. It's a difficult river to get over. If the Russians get over the Oskil River to the west, and they move westwards over the Oskil River and move back into the areas that Ukraine liberated in late 2022, then that will be a big loss to Ukraine. And the Russians look as if they're thinking of doing that. And they still haven't taken a bit further to the south. They still haven't taken Chasiv Yar yet, again, with more pressure on it. They look as if they've taken very near to Toretsk, as you mentioned. They haven't quite taken it yet. But in all of these places, what they do is they bombard it to rubble, try to surround it. When the Ukrainians then withdraw, then the Russians move in and take over the rubble. That's what they're doing. But they are making progress. The other point to make about this, though, Kate, is that there's no indication that where they do make progress, as they might in Pokrovsk, they might in Chasiv Yar, they have no capacity, as far as any of us can see, to break out. You know, in military terms, you always talk about a breakout battle. You make a breakthrough and then you break out into the open country behind, and you're off and running. The Russians have no capacity to break out of their victories as and when they get them. So it looks as if they will get some more tactical victories all around the front. But no breakout, not this year.
And just sit there and hold it for as long as possible, or until when?
Yes. Well, they'll hold it until the spring, and then I think their intention will be, if they could grab Pokrovsk, grab Chasiv Yar, grab Kupiansk, get over the Oskil River, at least by the early part of the winter, then they'll sit there. They'll keep fighting, but they'll sit there and then try for a more strategic offensive in the spring of next year, in order to break out from there. That's what they'd like to try to do. I still think they won't be able to do that. But if I was on the Russian general staff, then my thinking will be something along those lines.
President Zelensky has presented his victory plan to Parliament and is also doing so at the European Union summit. Some parts are being kept secret, but what are your takeaways?
Yeah, I think we're dealing with two victory plans here, Kate. I mean, one victory plan is the one that he's talking openly about to his own Parliament, the Rada, and in the United States and to Congress, and he's briefing people about. And that plan is pretty uncompromising. And it says that, you know, we need more help. We need economic help. We need military help. The Russians must lose. We demand that we restore our territorial boundaries, our legal boundaries back to 1991, which is not surprising. So that victory plan is really a series of demands. It's a shopping list of demands. There's another victory plan, which is much more private, which reputedly has been shown to some Russians via Turkey, reportedly, which has been briefed with the American embassy in Kyiv, and which the Americans know about. And this other victory plan is a more practical, pragmatic plan for what things might look like in the spring of 2025, and how the Ukrainians could build on some military success, some economic reconstruction, the possibility of new elections, because they need fresh elections. The election should have been this year, but you can't hold the election during the period of war. But if there was some sort of ceasefire on more favourable terms, early part of next year, spring or summer of next year, then elections might be possible, and that would be a political bonus for Ukraine and for the Allies as well. So I think there's another victory plan which we can only guess at, which is much more pragmatic than this shopping list of demands which we've got so far.
US President Joe Biden has announced a new military assistance package for Ukraine of $425 million following a phone call with President Zelensky. Do you think that he's been swayed by President Zelensky's recent campaigning tours for support, or was this expected?
No, I think the amount of funding that Joe Biden is announcing, and Tony Blinken has also reinforced, is part of the drawdown from the $61 billion, which the Americans finally agreed in March of this year. Remember, they were due to agree before Christmas, and it delayed and delayed and delayed. They finally agreed it in March. And so this is an amount of money that wasn't given to Ukraine. It was a funding to be drawn down for specific purposes. And bear in mind that something like 90% of this money gets spent in the United States because it's spent on military equipment, which is built in the United States. So all this drawdown was there in any case. I mean, when the fact that they choose to announce it is a political statement. It shows that Joe Biden means what he says. It sounds good, but it's double counting. It's not new money. It's a drawdown from money that was previously allocated.
So, to be expected. President Zelensky believes that implementation of his victory plan now will make it possible to end the war no later than next year. I know you saying that perhaps part of the secret side of this plan may involve some kind of plan towards that. If you follow his logic, though, how does it unfold?
I think Zelensky's logic is that he knows he can't sustain a war for another 3 or 4 years without much more Western support and stronger political backing from the West, because that political backing has been crumbling visibly during this year. And I think his sense is that for the sake of his own people as well, pragmatically, he's got to show the West that there is a political route out of this. And that route might involve some sort of truce next year, but on more favourable terms than would exist at the moment. Some sort of truce at the moment on the basis of where the front lines are now would mean Ukraine giving up 20% of its territory and being in a very, very insecure position further onwards from there. So I think the victory plan is an attempt to convince the West that he can conceive of a politico-military future which actually might create a pause, but ultimately must get to a point where it pressurizes the Russians to withdraw from some or all of the territory, which puts the Russians under pressure rather than rewards them for their aggression. And all of his commentary around the public version of the victory plan was that Russia must not succeed. Putin must not be seen to succeed in naked aggression. So the victory plan is an attempt to have a politico-military pause next year that leads to more pressure on the Russians. In his sense, he would say, to come to their senses and agree that they can't carry on attacking Ukraine like this.
Mike, in terms of the pressure on the Russians, we were speaking to Anders Asland, the economist, and he was telling us that he had met with the head of Ukraine's military intelligence in recent weeks, and had been told by him that Russia itself would want to sue for peace. Perhaps as early as 2025 because of financial reasons. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, the Russians have announced a 15% cut in social security spending for next year. They've announced a series of tax rises for next year. It's clear that this year the Russians have started to pay for this war in ways they didn't have to. Next year they're going to pay even more for it. The Russians have used up at least half of their existing sovereign wealth fund on the war. And that's not invested money. That's just money that's gone up in smoke, quite literally. And so the Russian economy will struggle next year. It's had an immediate boost because of the shift to war production. But that's a very inefficient way of boosting an economy, as anyone will tell you over the last 100 years. If it has to be done, it has to be done. But it's not an efficient way of creating, new jobs and new industries. So the Russian economy will begin to struggle next year, as will its manpower problem. And one of the things that's being said in Western capitals is that, if we can help Ukraine get through to next year, then by the middle to end of next year and into 2026, the Russians will really be feeling it. Well, I mean, that's true, at least statistically that is true. But if Putin is prepared to get weapons from all of his friends and to use foreign troops to defend his own territory, if his pride is not sufficiently hurt by doing all those things to keep on doing it, who's to say that they won't carry on?
Can we just talk a little bit about Moldova? In just a few days, there are votes in a combined presidential election and referendum on joining the European Union. Russia has been trying to restore its influence over Moldova for years now. How much significance does the future of Moldova have for Ukraine?
Oh, it's really important because Moldova is that little territory to the west of Ukraine. And there's the Transnistrian Republic, which is a sort of Russian breakaway or self-declared breakaway republic, Transnistria, which is the old basis along the Dniester River. It's the old basis of the 14th Army, the old Soviet 14th Army. And a lot of the Russian speakers there who are virulently pro-Russian, pro-Putin are the officers and their families who retired there. And Moldova is a very small country, very vulnerable. And if the Russians, as they originally intended, had come westwards across Ukraine through Mariupol and then to the land bridge in Crimea and then up to Mykolaiv and then Odessa to grab the port on the western part of the Black Sea, they'd have carried on going another 50 miles to Moldova. And Transnistria would have declared itself then part of Russia. And the Russians would have then, as it were, destabilized the rest of Moldova, and that would have been part of the new Russian empire that Putin clearly wants to build. That's the obvious idea. There is a pro-European, pro-democratic government in Ukraine, in Moldova, which Putin hates because he used to have a puppet government in there, and they've done all they can to destabilize Moldova. The European Union have tried what they can to help, and they've given financial support, but Moldova is such a very small country that the vote that's taking place this weekend on the 20th, the 17th, 3 days time, the vote that will take place will be very, very critical. And there's so much dirty tricks been going on with this election. We'll have to see how they get on with it. It will be a contested result, I'm sure, whatever it is. And the possibilities of violence in Moldova, starting from next week, can't be ruled out, sadly.
Yeah, Mike, Mark Rutte, the new Secretary General of NATO, has been to NATO's military headquarters. He's also been to the US military base in Wiesbaden in Germany, where Ukraine aid will be coordinated. He's been very robust about the alliance's support for Ukraine and refusal to be intimidated by Russia. Can he really get things moving and moving fast?
Well, he's determined to try. Yeah, the Wiesbaden meeting and the base at Wiesbaden is the European replacement for the Ramstein arrangement. So Ramstein is the big American base where all the coordination has been done so far. And what Mark Rutte is trying to do is to Europeanize the whole process, to take some of the pressure off the United States, to show that the Europeans can do it as well as the Americans, and that they don't have to do it all. And the Wiesbaden arrangement is an attempt to help the Europeans create a coordinating center. In a way, it's an attempt to Trump-proof the future of NATO's support to Ukraine if Trump were to win the American elections. And a lot of good things can go on there. The problem is that without America's inputs, it doesn't matter whether you organize it from Ramstein or Wiesbaden, without American inputs, the Europeans haven't got enough to give quickly enough to Ukraine.
You were at NATO's military headquarters in Mons in Belgium around the same time that Mark Rutte was passing through. And I know you met the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. Did he give you a sense of where he's at and his thinking about the challenges facing NATO and the military alliance at the moment?
Yeah, I think dissent, Deputy Supreme Commander Europe, was very clear about that. Admiral Blount, British Admiral. And he was very coherent, and he gripped the issues that NATO has got to deal with a bigger range of challenges now, from basic military capacity, the number of enablers that it's got, transport, air transport, refueling, logistics. I mean, NATO is not good enough at any of those things, and it relies far too much on the Americans. So European NATO nations have got to do more, right through to grasping the problems of space. Where the issues of space for warfare have become much more complex, because space, low Earth orbit, for instance, has got about 8,000 satellites in it at the moment, but most of them are now privately owned. And it's the private sector which is calling the shots in low Earth orbit. And the military have got to somehow find ways of leveraging what they can get from the private sector and integrate that into future battle plans. But he was very clear on what their tasks were. And he was also very clear on how little time there is to get this ready. We don't have a decade to think about all this, getting this right, as we used to think in the mid 2010s, 2015. We thought, oh, we've got at least a decade. Well, we haven't. We've got 2 or 3 years before these things have either got to be there or not, because the challenges that we're facing in European security, now that Europe is involved in a shooting war, are coming at us pretty soon.
Did he give you any insight into his thinking on Ukraine and the challenges facing the alliance there?
I think on Ukraine, he was taking the standard line that we NATO are doing all that we can, and that NATO is the right sort of coordination mechanism to put all this stuff together. But of course, what he can't say, and as dissent is a military officer, he can't, as it would, dictate the political commitment of NATO to all of this. All he can say is that the militaries are very good at coordinating what they can offer, and that is true. And as dissent, his job, in a sense, is to be the chief operating officer for the integrated alliance, 32 nations. And of course, he said it's much more complex. NATO used to be 12, then 16. Now it's 32, double that number. But he said it's quite interesting what sort of contributions even the smaller nations can make. And they're all quite anxious to make a contribution, particularly the smaller ones, to show that they matter. And so he was actually rather interesting on both the challenges, but also the opportunities of creating integrated alliance structures. But that doesn't get you over the political problem or the managerial problem of just having 32 delegations, all of whom wanting jobs and roles and something to do that's useful in the headquarters.
Just to return to more of the specifics and the developments of the war in Ukraine and Russia's position. Interesting reports of a damning letter from behind bars of the Russian former officer Igor Girkin, who said that 2025 and possibly late 2024 will be a serious test for Russia, that its full-scale invasion has consumed or is finishing its weapons reserves, expending its personnel, taking away from the labour market. I mean, these are things that you kind of already mentioned, really, but that the summer of fall 2024, the offensive campaign did not achieve its goals. It's interesting that he'd be doing that and sending that letter from prison, and that it's got out there, assuming that these reports are all true. But why do you think he's done this now, and what difference will him saying it make?
Yeah, Igor Girkin. His real name is Strelkov, and he was involved in the 2014 arrangements. He is blamed for bringing down the airliner in 2014 of shooting the missile. When they brought down a Ukrainian airliner over the Donbass. It was all him. And he's now in prison. But even when he wasn't in prison, he's an ultra-nationalist. And his argument is always Russia is not fighting this war seriously, that they should fight a full war to conquer Ukraine in the proper sort of way. They should mobilize the whole of society and get on with it and do it. I mean, he's more Putin than Putin, if you see what I mean. And his criticism was always that the Russians weren't being serious enough about their need to conquer Ukraine. And funnily enough, I mean, what he said tactically usually chimed in with Western analysts, what they were saying about the tactical problems of the Russian forces, because he has that, the ability of the rebel and the military professional, which he is, that ability to tell truth to power, to tell it the way he sees it. And so, interesting that, smuggling a letter out from prison saying that exactly the sort of things he used to say before he went to prison, is almost comical, actually, because it seems true. It seems what he says is entirely plausible. And saying that the Russians can't carry on like this into 2025 is rather what the Western allies are hoping to be the case. And the Western allies are trying to analyze more scientifically whether that will turn out to be true.
And what of the next peace conference? What do you understand to be the progress of getting to that one and Russia being involved?
Well, there will be another international conference, but the Russians won't be involved. But the peace conference idea is really to convince the global South that the Ukrainians have a good case, and that the Ukrainians are not just fighting mindlessly, and that that they stand for something important. And in a way that the Ukrainians peace conference, I mean, the last one wasn't a great success, but they went through with it. And this next one probably won't be a huge success, but they'll still go through with it. They're trying to peel away countries like India in particular, and countries like Nigeria and South Africa. These are important countries who are standing off the whole thing. In the case of India, of course, they're actively helping Putin by buying his oil. And they'd like to make common cause, the Ukrainians, with China in terms of saying, well, you've got a 10-point peace plan. We've got a peace plan. Let's see where they coincide. Let's work with you toward getting some peace. If the Russians don't want to be there because they won't talk, that's up to them. And so the idea of another peace conference is not to articulate the road to peace as such, but to work on the outside world to bring people closer to Ukraine's position, because the Ukrainians are feeling very isolated at the moment. They're isolated from the global south, who frankly don't really care about Ukraine, and they're feeling increasingly isolated from the West, who are having severe doubts within the politics of the West as to whether we can carry on with this too much longer.
As we move towards or wait for any kind of peace agreement that may stand and finally be made, and made perhaps on terms that are acceptable to Ukraine, in the meantime, how much progress do you think Russia is making in the occupied areas such that they will be absolutely impossible to return to Ukraine because of how they've fundamentally been changed, their structure, their people, their culture?
Yeah, I mean, they've been doing this certainly over the last couple of years. So the abduction of children, I mean, 19,000 that we know of, but the real figure is got to be a lot higher than that. There's 19,000 names, but lots and lots of children who we don't have names for have been abducted and are being taken to Russia to be brought up as if they were orphans and brought up by adoptive parents. And they've changed the curriculum in the schools, and they're making people do things as they would do in Russia. Over a longer period, that will have an effect. I don't think it'll have a big effect on the Ukrainians who are under Russian control now. But judging by what happened in Crimea after 2014, the Russians literally colonized Crimea. And there's 800,000 Russians in Crimea. The vast majority of them came in since 2014. So what the Russians will try to do is offer lots of financial incentives for Russian families to go and live in occupied Ukraine, rebuild the areas where they can and so on, and they will try to colonize them. So I think the effect will be cumulative. It won't make a huge difference in years 2, 3, 4 and 5, but think about years 10 to 15 to 20, then colonization takes place. That's what empires have done for the last 3,000 years.
And just finally, Mike, in a sobering article by For Russi, Tim Wellesley, hope I said that right, a senior associate fellow, warns of impending betrayal of Ukraine because of waning Western support, the 2024 US presidential election, and the failure of Europe to commit to defeat the invasion, with the events of the 7th of October last year in Israel doing untold damage to Ukraine's prospects. Is there a small but closing window of opportunity to prove him wrong?
I'd like to hope that there is, but I agree with pretty well everything he says there. It's a very gloomy assessment, but it's hard to be more cheerful just at the moment. So much will depend on the American election. If Trump wins the election, then the betrayal of Ukraine will be immediate, in the sense that, I mean, Tim's view is that Trump will be on the phone a couple of days after his victory, long before he actually takes over as president in January, and he'll talk to Putin about the deal that he will do. Sorry. I'll do that again. He'll be on the phone to Putin. He'll talk to Putin about the deal he intends to do, ending the war in 24 hours. And of course, any war can end in 24 hours if one side surrenders. And so his deal will be to freeze the boundaries where the fighting is, probably even where the fighting isn't, give Putin what he wants. And Putin will agree a whole series of very strong sounding commitments with solemn and binding declarations of stabilization, of that this is an end to it. This is the end of the war. And the Russians will observe all sorts of things to prove that it is. And Putin will sign up to all of them willingly with a smile, because he won't keep them. And he knows that when he breaks those things, which he will within 6 months or a year, because, I mean, show me any territorial agreement since 2000 that he's kept to. There isn't one. So when he breaks them, his view is that the Americans won't mind. I mean, they'll just pretend it's not their problem, because they'll say, well, we did the deal. If it's broken down, that's the Europeans' problem. And for Putin, the attraction of this deal with Trump is that it takes the Americans out of the equation. It gives the Americans an escape from the whole problem of Ukraine. Trump would say, look, I did the deal, I brought peace, the peace is broken down, not my fault. And it means that the Russians only have to deal with the Europeans in their attempt to conquer the rest of Ukraine. And Putin calculates that he's got the Europeans scared. And he's not wrong on that, generally speaking.
But he hasn't won yet, has he?
He hasn't won yet, and things may change. I mean, wars are full of unpredictable twists and turns, but the present trajectory, that's what Tim is saying in this article, the trajectory we are on, the road down which we are embarked, is a road of betrayal. It's either instant betrayal in the case of a Trump presidency, or it's slower betrayal if it's left to a Kamala Harris presidency working with the Europeans, whose best hope at the moment is to keep this whole thing moving until 2025 and hope that the strains in the Russian economy somehow changes the view of Putin as to what he can achieve. So good luck with that one.
Mike, it's been good talking to you. Let's talk again soon. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.